So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this latest in our series of talks around the exhibition Cosmopolis, the Impact of Refugee Art Dealers in London. My name's Helena Cuss. I'm a PhD student at Kingston University and the Ben-Uri Research Unit and the curator of Cosmopolis. Tonight, our speaker is Cherith Summers. Cherith works as an art advisor for Murphy and Partners, where she advises on contemporary, post-war, and emerging art. As an art historian, Cherith's research has predominantly focused on galleries operating in post-war London, with a particular focus on the Hanover Gallery and its proprietor Erica Brausen, and especially the impact of galleries run by émigrés and their role as sites which help to promote the work of émigré, queer, and female artists. The title of her talk tonight is Defining the Female Gaze, the Woman Gallerist, the Woman Artist, and the Image of Women in a New World. And I'm especially thrilled to be introducing Cherith tonight because, as co-curator of an exhibition at Sotheby's 5 years ago called Brave New Visions, the Emigres Who Transformed the British Art World, she's been enormously helpful and generous to me in sharing research advice on this topic for my PhD. And of course, that's fed into the present exhibition at Ben-Uri. So Cherith is going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a 15 or so minutes for a Q&A session at the end. So please put your questions or comments in the chat as they occur to you, and I will put them to Cherith at the end. This talk is being recorded, so if it hasn't happened kind of automatically, please make sure that your microphones and screen remain switched off throughout so that there's no interference during the talk. And I will hand over to Cherith to share her screen.
Okay, great. So as Helena said, the title of my talk is Defining the Female Gaze, the Women Gallerist, the Women Artist, and the Image of Women in a New World. When conceiving of this paper, I wanted to find a definition of cosmopolis as a compass point to orient my thoughts. I came across a passage in Leonie Sandercock's Cosmopolis 2, in which the author describes dreaming cosmopolis, my utopia, a construction site of the mind, a city or region in which there is genuine acceptance of, connection with, and respect and space for the cultural other, the possibility of togetherness in difference. This concept, beautifully articulated and optimistically conceived, is the definition of cosmopolis that I've chosen to hew towards when I wrote this paper. London in the years immediately preceding, during, and after World War II became a city infused by immigrants from mainland Europe, who brought with them different cultures, different practices, and different philosophies. Of course, the city is one which has been defined by waves of immigration throughout its history, but in this short space of time, much changed in Britain's cultural capital. As the exhibition we are gathered hereby demonstrates, amongst London's new arrivals were a group of art dealers who brought with them new modes of business and, in many cases, a taste for art which was culturally other to British audiences and the British art world. This paper takes as its subject the proprietor of the Hanover Gallery, Erica Brausen, a Dusseldorf-born German national who was neither Jewish nor, while in Germany, a political activist, but rather who was a queer woman in a world which barely acknowledged their existence. Erica's flight to the UK in 1936 was precipitated by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, but she had left Germany some time before, as the rising presence and sway of the NSDAP spelled out increasing hostility and intolerance for difference of all kinds. Brausen went first to Paris, arriving at the end of the Année Folle, where she found in this European cosmopolis one of the richest lesbian communities in the world, described by Natalie Barney as the only city where you could live and express yourself as you please. The community there, into which Brausen swiftly assimilated, opted out of received ideas of what it meant to be a woman as the precondition of both personal and professional fulfillment. In 1949, Simone de Beauvoir's publication of The Second Sex, which boldly declared that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, lit a match under the concept of these received ideas of femininity, eventually igniting a fire that would burn down many of the structures which had trapped women in limited societal roles. In this paper, I'm choosing to focus on Brausen as a woman who made the decision to opt out of these received ideas and who brought to London this particular cultural otherness. Some years after her death, her colleague Jean-Yves Mock sold much of Brausen's collection at auction, noting that, I thought by selling everything, I would pay a small tribute to Erica. Perhaps it will give people the idea that dealers, even when they are dead, should be thought of in quite a different way. She opened England up to wider tastes. I've written elsewhere of Brausen's role as a figure who created space for and promoted queer artists, a contribution to Cosmopolis which cannot be understated for its long-term impact on the British and global art worlds. But here today, I wish to consider her as a proponent of women artists, and more specifically of women artists who chose to buck received ideas of what it meant to be a woman in their work, choosing to make art defined by their own distinctively female gaze. Erica Brausen's choice to live her life opting out of received ideas of what it meant to be a woman can be seen both personally and professionally. While she had taken a British husband in 1946 in a lavender marriage likely to ensure her ability to securely reside and work in Britain, from 1945, Brausen devoted herself to the great love of her life, glamorous Dutch-Indonesian archaeologist, model, and sometimes spy Katerina Toto Koopman, who I'm showing to you on the screen on the left. In keeping with a time where homosexual behaviour from men was criminalised and queer female identities were unrecognised, the couple's romantic relationship is elided from contemporaneous record. A House and Garden publication on their shared home describes Koopman and Brausen as two women with very different careers who share a small studio. But the lack of historical record of their romantic relationship belies the fact that the two seem to have lived far from a closeted life, publicly supporting one another at the Hanover, where Koopman hosted the vernissage, introducing painters and sculptors to various art collectors with perfect charm and natural ease, while Erica was more practical and harder to approach. Beyond her romantic relationships, Brausen's manner of self-expression also rejected societal expectations of women at the time. She kept her hair closely cropped and dressed androgynously, wearing mannish but beautifully tailored clothes, beautiful shirts. This manner of epicene dressing pervaded the Parisian lesbian community that had been Brausen's former home. Madeleine Pelletier, a member of this community, described the impetus behind these sartorial choices as one imbued with meaning, noting that my costume says to the male, I am your equal. If those who wear short hair and starched shirt collars have all the freedom, all the power, well then, I too will wear short hair and a starched shirt collar. Brausen did not seek to be agreeable, nor was she bashful. Her manner was described by artist Liliane Lynn as very straight and direct. She never beat about the bush at all. Jean-Yves Mock seconded this description, noting that she was refined and determined to be herself in every way. She knew to affirm choices, make them known, and if possible, impose them. Brausen's choices, her imperious taste, defined the art which filled the Hanover Gallery's walls for the majority of its existence. She refused to compromise on her vision, even when it risked the future of the Hanover itself. One of the gallery's financial backers, collector, and Sunday painter aficionado Arthur Jeffress, had begun his relationship with the Hanover contributing curatorially to the shows which filled its walls. By 1953, Brausen's control of the programming had become more entrenched, causing Jeffress to withdraw his support and call upon fellow financial backer Elsa Barker-Mill to close the gallery. The Hanover was saved by a stroke of fortune when stockbroker Michael Behrens chanced upon it days prior to closure and agreed to buy out Jeffress and Barker-Mill. Behrens was an avid collector, but let Brausen take the reins of the programming, and over the next 19 years, Brausen solidified the Hanover's reputations as one of London's premier galleries, time and again the scene of daring incursions far beyond the frontier of Mayfair taste. Within this brief biography, I hope I've helped you to catch a glimpse of a woman who chose to define rather than be defined, who lived her life outside of societal norms and became an arbiter of taste, a recognised authority who, in the words of Francis Bacon, had the best eye in the art world. I wish then to turn our eyes to the work of two of the artists shown by this woman, whose work portrayed women and femininity as broader, deeper, and more complex than was the cultural mode. Germaine Richier was one of the artists whom Brausen supported most enthusiastically at the Hanover Gallery. The artist had been exhibited in London once prior to the Hanover Association, with a show in 1947 at the Anglo-French Art Centre in St John's Wood, which critic Lawrence Alloway described as neglected. By the time of the 1955 exhibition at the Hanover, Richier had made a name for herself internationally, and this show successfully established her reputation in England. Brausen would go on to show Richier 6 further times in 3 group shows prior to the artist's premature death in 1959, and 3 further shows thereafter. She lived with one of Richier's sculptures until her death. A classically trained sculptor taught by Antoine Bourdelle, Richier's work came into its own in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Influenced by the sight of the body casts of the Pompeian victims on a 1935 trip to the foot of Vesuvius, and with the memory of the war's horrors fresh in her mind, the artist began to develop a unique sculptural language, which critic David Sylvester described as a physical assault on the human body. Her classical forms began to transform, willfully split, with broken heads, the pitted torsos and the shrunken limbs disintegrating. As they disintegrated, though, Richier's sculptures began to integrate something new. The world of nature began to encroach on the human form. René Dessolier first used the term hybrids in 1953 to describe the way in which Richier's post-war sculptures occupy a liminal space between human, animal, and plant life. This new artistic language seems to have been recognized contemporaneously as being distinctly that of a woman. In the catalogue for the 1955 exhibition, André Pierre de Miandargues described these figures as beings which live under the cover of the branches, restless and alert. Their life is given to provoking desire and escaping from it, and above all in watching their prey and in fleeing from those who prey on them. One might conclude that only a woman could understand and render this. Indeed, while both Richier and Richier's male and female subjects became bestial hybrids, Richier's treatment of the female body was perhaps most iconoclastic. As described by Sarah Wilson, Richier's spiky, insect-like creatures portray the female body in non-idealized forms. The hybrid sculptures included in the 1955 show exemplify this well. The earliest of these is La Sauterelle, which is on your screen right now. La Sauterelle depicts a woman or grasshopper, crouching, leaning forwards with hands outstretched. An immediate and easy reading of how this work rejects classical depictions of femininity can be made by simply studying Richier's choice to avoid classic beauty, with her deliberate pitting of the surface and attenuation of the limbs, the physical assault on the human body described by Sylvester, but this misses the greater complexity at play. The sculpture's form is distinctively that of a woman, but the pose is definitively more bestial. Earthbound by a fifth appendage, which recalls the spike-shaped ovipositor of a female grasshopper, the figure seems to plead while threatening to pounce, occupying a liminal space between watching its prey and fleeing from those who prey on it, in de Miandargues' parlance. La Sauterelle rejects simplistic readings and shies away from feminine tropes. We see a complex femininity illustrated, one which can harm as well as be harmed, a creature which is not passive, but is rather an active player in the tableau of Richier's imagined kingdom. Richier felt her own lack of passivity profoundly, writing to her first husband, Otto Banninger, that my nature does not let me be calm. We are what we are, and age isn't making me gentler or more serene. Not that I'm fighting it, it's with me, a part of me. The choice to reflect this lack of serenity in La Sauterelle was highly effective. Critic Georges Lambert recalled being transfixed by the work upon seeing it in Richier's studio. This imaginary being, cast in plaster, nearly crouching, with its long arms extending in open, menacing hands, its human face wore a tense, raging expression. The tension between predator and prey appears again in L'Araignée, which again is on your screen. Once more, Richier depicts femininity characterized by ugliness and unease. Her spider woman is captured in suspended motion, seemingly checked mid-leap by strands of her own cast web. Richier's interpretation of the subject calls to mind artist Louise Bourgeois, who began to create her own sculptures of women qua spider in the 1990s. For Bourgeois, the spider was an image of her mother, deliberate, clever, patient, soothing, reasonable, dainty, subtle, indispensable, neat, and as useful as a spider. Richier's arachnid seems the yang to Bourgeois' yin. If there are maternal emotions to be found here, they are in the defensive instinct of a mother to protect her young. In fact, Richier seems to have made a conscious choice to look at the darker side of human nature and instinct. The artist later described the imperative to shine light into these dark corners as being one imposed by the horrors of the 20th century, stating that we decidedly cannot constrain human expression in the drama of our time. In these hybrids, perhaps then we see Richier choosing to free her female subjects from societal constraints on women's ability to express the fullness of their humanity. She certainly was no stranger to the idea of constraint. Her own father had discouraged her pursuit of art as a career on the basis of her sex. Women aren't made for art, my father used to say. What then are women made for? Another of Richier's sculptures seems to engage with this question head on. Lo, in front of you, appends the name of water to a hybridized woman or amphora, whose head has been severed to leave her body as vessel alone. Does the sculpture's title direct us only to see what this female body has the potential to contain? We can perhaps read here of the identity-eliding power of motherhood, or of the elision of female personhood in face of the expectations placed upon her fertility. Richier herself bore no children besides her sculptures, as one critic would later write. Whatever her sentiment towards the idea of the female body as vessel, the work is disquieting. The aggression of the hybrids replaced instead by violence upon the female form. Richier was a member of the first generation of women to be able to take up formal arts education, and had mixed in a cultural milieu filled with female artists whose work was often acknowledged for its strength and quality. But in her time, the battle for equal rights for women and for women artists was far from won. In France, women had only won the right to vote in 1945, and married women only won the right to open their own bank accounts and take their own jobs in 1965, 5 years after Richier's death. She faced prejudice as a female artist. Paul Gut's 1957 tale of a visit to her studio is just one example of this type of bias, as the critic comments on her body and gender. I am not surprised by the monumental lines on which Mademoiselle Germaine Richier is constructed. She must fight against her own sex, against resistant matter, against dirt, discouragement, and cold. Richier did fight against her sex, a fight shared by many other female artists of her generation, a fight against being pigeonholed as a women artist, and a fight to be seen as the equal of male artists in every way, including by denying the structural disadvantages that female artists faced. Together with painter Maria Helena Vieira da Silva, Richier argued in 1956 that we face no obstacles and no different conditions. Men struggle too. Certainly in her lifetime, Richier was acclaimed. She was the first woman to have a solo exhibition at the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris in 1956, and she became one of the first female artists to have a truly successful international career. But in the years since her death, Richier's reputation has faltered, where those of her male peers have flourished. The transformation of her works in the post-war era has by some been attributed to the influence of her second husband, René Solier. Perhaps then her fight was lost. But the legacy of an artistic language can be seen in many places other than in auction results and museum shows. Towards the end of her life, Richier had made several collaborative works with Vieira da Silva, wherein she fused her own distinctive take on the human form with Vieira da Silva's mosaic-like abstractions. These works were important precursors for another French sculptor whose work Erica Brausen supported staunchly and whose images of women were transformative. As noted by Sarah Wilson, before pop or nouveau realism, before the polychrome sculpture of Annick de Saint-Phal, Richier's little-known polychrome hybrids look to the future. Half a decade into that future, in 1964, the Hanover was the stage for Annick de Saint-Phal's inaugural London exhibition. The artist had already made a name for herself internationally with her hybrid painting/performance art pieces, The Tear, wherein she or collaborators would shoot at canvases. These works were radical expressions of female rage. Later in life, Samphal would recall that I was raped by my father when I was 11, so perhaps it's no wonder I started shooting my canvases. By the time of the Hanover Gallery exhibition, Samphal was channeling this energy into a new body of work. Nikki de Samphal, You Are My Dragon, was opened by an all-women band playing the American national anthem, providing context for Samphal's curiously mad fantasy, a madcap group of monsters, sculptures of fabulous creatures and larger-than-life women made from chicken wire, newspaper, toys and dolls bought at Paris stores, lizards and pistols. In Samphal's Monsters, the artist turns her metaphorical aim at female archetypes: wife, childbearer, devouring mother, whore, witch. Among the works displayed was a large sculpture of a bride titled Finally, which was described by John Russell as one of the year's most incisive titles. Finally belongs to a group of works executed by Samphal around 1963 to 65, wherein she lampooned the idea of marriage as women's ultimate achievement. Samphal had grown up with the impression of her own mother's subjugation within the system of marriage, describing her as a prisoner of an imposed role, a role handed down generation after generation by a long tradition which no one ever questioned. She too participated in this tradition, marrying her first husband at the tender age of 18 and bearing him 2 children before leaving the marriage in 1960. The weight of this personally felt tradition is palpable in Samphal's mariés, densely built-up figures weighed down by the trappings of their bridal gowns, a visual representation of the pressure of the institution which they are entering. Their surfaces are thickly encrusted with whitewashed baby dolls and shoes, an allusion perhaps to the childbearing expectation incumbent upon wives. Birds, snakes, reptiles, and toy horses, perhaps recording Nikki's own lost passion for horse riding. Their heads are undersized compared to their grotesquely large bodies, their facial features obscured by clouds of hair, veils, and thick coats of white paint. The artist seems to paint the act of women's selfhood being lost within an institution designed to suppress it, fragmented, fractured, and entering into imprisonment as it enters into matrimony. Next in Samphal's firing line was the institution of motherhood. Motherhood had been challenging for the artist, who wrote in her autobiography, "How could I be a mother? I was too young and scared. Then I started thinking, we are all devouring mothers. Mother devoured me, and in turn I thought I knew best for my children." Hanging on the wall of the Hanover was another of Samphal's large-scale figures, Lucrezia, or the White Goddess, from circa 1964. Like her Mariée figures, Lucrezia is whitewashed and with a body which is disproportionate to the figure's small and almost childlike head. This woman, however, is not bound for the altar, but rather seems to be captured in the act of giving birth, not to a human infant, but rather to a beast, perhaps a horse. A contemporary reviewer described the body as torn apart in places like a stormy sky, the contents of a toy zoo, all twisting in and out of the holes in the body as if they were entrails. The tearing apart seems to be happening in the act of giving birth. The figure's torso gapes open, perhaps alluding to the violence sustained by the female body in labour. The surface of the sculpture is again encrusted with children's toys. A teddy bear emerges from one leg, baby dolls sprout from the chest, and a toy gun attached to the sculpture's right arm points towards the birthed creature. Samphal returned to images of maternal figures throughout her career, most notably in her series of Devouring Mothers. Among the other works shown in Samphal's inaugural show at the Hanover was one which was a precursor for what would become Samphal's enduring artistic legacy. Carl Stoker describes encountering a jaunty Venus, teetering on high heels, adorned with plastic flowers, a doll's legs springing from her body. Venus, on the left, a larger-than-life female figure whose lush, fertile form recalls the Venus of Willendorf, can be read as a proto-Nana. First shown in London by the Hanover in 1968, Samphal began her nanas in 1964 contemporaneously to the creation of Venus. The nanas, a French slang word for women, were wildly voluptuous sculptures of women who, in Samphal's words, were neither intimidated nor repressed by their lives or by men. And an example of the nanas is on the right. This is actually from the Hanover show in 1968. Venus and these later nanas took the form of fecund womanly bodies in the face of contemporary waif-thin fashion imagery. Thinking of the bodies in the context of fashion imagery is particularly interesting given Samphal's own history as a fashion model and the extent to which her own appearance was commented on in the context of her work. Two separate reviewers of the 1964 made allusion to Samphal's looks, one writing about the creator herself, blonde, pretty, thin as a wafer, and 33, and the second describing the work of a lithe, exuberant American girl called Niki de Samphal. A reviewer of the 1968 show made the point to contrast the artist and her creation's appearance, contrasting the plump polyester ladies who emanate from the equally feminine but far slimmer Niki de Samphal. Little wonder then, in the context of a critical reception which infantilized the artist and focused on her physical appearance, that Samphal saw the nanas as fierce things, threatening the patriarchy with the potential to become what she saw deep inside herself, une terroriste. The power implicit in these sculptures is a deeply feminized one. Samphal's inspiration for their form came from spending time with a heavily pregnant friend, and this overtly feminine shape defines the body of work. While in other works we see the artist wrestling with ideas of maternality and maternity, the Venus and the nanas seem to celebrate the fertile potential of the female body. The visual reference to sculptures and icons of fertility goddesses is no accident. Lucrezia's second title was the White Goddess, and the conceit of the ancient religion of the mother goddess was one which Samphal was to return to time and again throughout her career. Samphal seemed to find a powerful symbol of feminine potency in these depictions of the female body, which transgressed the boundaries of a passively defined, contained, and rarefied femininity in art and life, even as they verged on a kind of essentialism, grounding maternity and nurturing the female form. Venus and several of the early nanas perform as well as represent femininity, holding cartoonishly small handbags and with feet stuffed into high heels. The comic juxtaposition in scale between these accessories and the bodies to which they are affixed seems to highlight the ridiculousness of what Catherine Dosan calls the masquerade of hyperfemininity. Samphal was acutely conscious of this masquerade, recalling the power given to her mother by her looks. Dosan has written compellingly of Samphal's choice to perform her own femininity, a transformation which took place from the early 1960s. With her hair short and dishevelled, she wears a pair of blue jeans covered with paint, a baggy sweatshirt, and heavy boots. By the mid-1960s, when the nanas and Venus were being exhibited, she had begun to don feathers and a femme fatale attitude. As Dosan points out, in the French context, the masquerade of hyperfemininity was a political position, an effective counter-hegemonic and counter-patriarchal stance. The 1960s, when Samphal created these works, was the decade when the international feminist movement began in earnest. Richier, working a decade prior, had never addressed feminist readings of her work, while Samphal openly reckoned with them, stating that, since women are oppressed in today's society, I have tried, in my own personal way, to contribute to the women's liberation movement. In Samphal's Venus and Nanas, we see the artist situating the move towards this liberation as being one which takes place firmly in the female body, not by negating its femininity, but rather by embracing it. In this paper, I've looked at three women whose lives and work existed outside of the bounds of traditional ideas of womanhood. In the post-war world, where the status quo had been torn apart, these traditions were under the spotlight. Brausen's affinity for the work of Richier and Samphal is apparent in the frequency with which she chose to exhibit their works. I argue that she may have seen in their radical depictions of the female body images which expanded this definition and which felt like truer representation of the inner lives and realities of women in this new age. As she stood on the brink of a new world, as the fight for the rights of women and of queer people picked up pace, one of Brausen's contributions to the Cosmopolis of London was to stage shows by these artists, shows which embrace the possibility of togetherness and difference, which embrace the idea that women in this new age could be as multifaceted as the world in which she found herself. Before we conclude, I wish to turn our attention to one final work by Nikita Sanfal, which is on your screens at present. Executed in 1965, Sanfal sculpted a gravity-defying female figure, liberated, freed from worldly restrictions, seeming to dance through the air. The work was named Erica. And that is all for me. I feel like I've spoken quite fast.
That was so interesting, Tara. Thank you so much. And I love that that last work was called Erica. That's a really
Me
lovely.
too.
I think that it's so interesting with these art dealers. It's often so difficult to they don't leave behind like these handy statements saying this is the kind of art I was interested in and this is why I supported it and all this stuff. So you have to do all this painstaking work of building exhibition histories and then going through and looking at all the artists and identifying trends. And then occasionally you stumble across one that really relates to their kind of personal biographies or experiences. So it's such an interesting way of doing art history. And we're going to have another talk about another female dealer in the exhibition called Leah Bonda Yare, who did a lot with transnational female modernists coming up. So there's definitely a trend for women art dealers supporting other women, which is really interesting. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. I have a few observations, so I'd love to put to you. Brausen was obviously kind of what's thought of as an ideological dealer. She wasn't motivated so much by making money and was very kind of genuinely passionate about contemporary art. Do you know if the gallery made any money? Was it always run at a loss?
No, they did make money, but they made money less by what they were exhibiting. The predominant way in which Erica made money, I think, in the 1960s was that she had a large stock of clay drawings, which she was selling in private transactions. Now, clay was in one or two group shows that the Hanover did over the years, but by no means an artist that the Hanover was particularly known for. That's one example of an artist whom she sold really as a way of sustaining financially the shows that she was staging, which were a little bit more controversial. I mean, the Hanover had 2 floors, and a contemporaneous account of how they operated described her as showing the sort of challenging work, which we really remember the Hanover by, and which we kind of remember the past century by. So works by people like Francis Bacon downstairs in the main exhibiting space, while upstairs and in the back cabinets, she was showing the work that actually sold and brought revenue in.
Yeah, and I think that was quite a common strategy for a lot of these dealers who really wanted to kind of break new ground, but obviously it was not always the most it was quite a conservative client base. So they had these other more saleable artists on the side. Question from Alice Strang. Great talk, thank you. Is there something I can read about post-World War II UK female dealers and their successors? So I know of
no.
UK specific. There is a relatively new book that I think came out possibly this year. I have to look it up quickly to remember it, called Women Art Dealers. I'll find it in a second and try and put it in the chat. And that looks at women art dealers from roughly 45 to 1970. But I think there's maybe one UK example. There's really not very much on UK dealers. I mean, we try, with this talks program, we try to get as many speakers as possible on the women because they're so often under-researched and not known about. But it would be really great to see, because there are people working on them. It'd be great to have that all collected in one place.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any particular resource that gathers encyclopedically the female dealers, because there certainly were some very, very interesting characters. Like Helen Lasore is super interesting. Peggy Guggenheim, very, very interesting. There were some great female dealers operating in London and elsewhere at the time, but I don't think anybody has ever really compiled anything particularly exhaustive, and certainly not looked at how they inspired the sort of generation of female art dealers that came after them.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, if someone wants to pull that together, that would be really
That'd be
interesting.
great.
I have a comment. In Jerusalem is an amazing work by Nikki de Saint-Phal called The Monster, which is in a small park, meant and serving as a slide for children.
Yeah.
I will look now to see if it's female. Yeah, Yona, do let us know. That does sound interesting. Thinking about Brausen's identity as a lesbian. You said like Paris was such an open place, and then obviously she ended up here. Like, what was the? I was really interested that you said that she and Toto kind of lived quite openly, which I was quite surprised by. I mean, do you have what her experience as a gay woman was like in London at that time? It's difficult.
The short answer is no. I mean, the sort of the queer angle of all of this is something I've researched quite extensively because I find it very interesting. But queer women really were treated as if they didn't exist, and as if that lifestyle wasn't. It just wasn't acknowledged. So there's next to nothing that I can find in terms of contemporaneous record. Certainly, I feel very confident to say that they lived very openly. There's journalistic reports which talk about them living together. Even later on, they bought a home in Panarea, which is referred to as being both of theirs. Whenever you read the biographies of the various people or books written by or contributed to by the people who knew them in their lifetime, they are always talked about as having been a couple by their friends, by other people in the art world. But as to the experience that Erica had as a lesbian woman, I can't find anything that speaks to it directly. I mean, the key thing that I would say is, as I say, she married a man right around the time that she met Tota. A queer British man, actually. So there was for both of them a marriage which probably enabled them to live their life a lot more free from scrutiny. And certainly in her business dealings, she tended to sign checks and things like that with her married name, which was Brausen Hazelden. So it's something that I can only make guesses at based on what little kind of glimpses there are from the outside. It's very hard to say what her experience really may have been.
And does she live with Clem Hazelden, or did they live together?
No.
No. Oh,
No.
interesting. Another question from Alice. When did Brausen die, and what happened to the Hanover Gallery thereafter?
Well, so the gallery closed before she died. The gallery closed in 1973. Basically what happened was Michael Behrens, who I mentioned earlier, who was the stockbroker, who sort of sustained the gallery from the 1950s onwards. He was actually the founder of a bank called the Ionian Bank. And in the 1970s, there was a financial crisis, and that bank collapsed. And when it collapsed, he came to her and said, listen, buy me out, or I have to pull out my funding. Brausen wasn't capable to. She described needing £1 million to be able to do that. And she wasn't capable. So the gallery shut in 1973, which was obviously a real shame for the British scene. It was actually bemoaned in the press at the time. Brausen herself passed away, I think, in 1992. And if I've gotten that year wrong, please forgive me. It's right around then. I might be mixing it up with the year that Francis Bacon died, because they died 1 year after the other. But she died in the early 1990s.
Yeah, and didn't she die not that long after Toto?
Yeah, very, very recently after Toto.
Like, is there any sense of what she did with the last 20 years of her life after the gallery closed?
Well, so she had Brausen had been in partnership with another London gallery, the Gampelfees, with a gallery space that they ran together in Switzerland called the Gampel Hanover. Now that was run by a woman called Anne Rotzler as the sort of on-site person who absolutely contributed very heavily curatorially to that program. They showed some great Swiss artists. But the Hanover and Gampel both contributed artists that were shown in Switzerland. That gallery ran until the early 1980s, and she certainly was engaged with that. up until that point in time. And frankly, at that stage, she was a relatively elderly woman. I know she still sort of saw things, but I don't think there was too much in the way of professional career beyond that point.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned Gampel fees, because one of the things that really struck me when you were talking about Germaine Richier is thinking about, thinking about Brausen's positioning in the wider London context. And certainly the impression I've had through my research is that in the early 50s, especially, the Hanover Gallery and Gampel fees were the only places that were willing to show avant-gardes, whether they were kind of avant-gardes from Europe or even America, and also supporting, kind of grassroots support for young British artists. And the kind of geometry of fear sculptors who were making, like welded metal stuff, who all became really famous at that time, were almost all represented by the Gampels and Erica Brausen. So
Yeah.
Erica, Eduardo Paolozzi, Reg Butler, and I think William Turnbull, and
Yeah.
Gampel. He's had Kenneth Armitage and Lynn Chadwick and a few others. And they were, Germaine Richier was, I think, was a big influence on them.
Yeah.
But because she had an early show at the ICA. But interestingly, I think, you hear much more about the influence of Alberto Giacometti on them, because he was working in, all working with the kind of similar iron metalworking sculptures. And obviously Giacometti was also shown by Brausen. But it's interesting to think, that it kind of partly started with a female sculptor, and then
Yeah.
the kind of British iteration of this new style was very, very, it was all men, all kind of young men. And, it just shows how easy it is for women to kind of get written out.
Well, interestingly, if you want to talk about Reg Butler, his wife, Rosemary Young, was actually shown by Brausen. I can't remember what year the show was, but she was given a solo show. And she was a sculptor of some serious skill herself, who described she married Reg, and Reg told her basically, I want you to focus on raising the children. And that was it. Her career went down the drain. So there's a lot of structural stuff which restrained female artists beyond just the fact that they maybe weren't always being exhibited in the same way that the male artists were. And I think talking about Giacometti and how he's talked about most often in relation to the geometry of fear really does go to the point which I find in researching this, but also before this, I find so frustrating, which is that Richier really was such a significant figure in her own time, very well recognized, very well respected as somebody who produced really important work. And then there are a number of contributing factors. She died prematurely. She died in 1959 at a relatively young age. That doesn't help, obviously, whereas Giacometti lived on, kept making work. That doesn't help. What also doesn't help is that her estate, unlike some of the other artists' estates, have not been so good at preserving and putting forth her legacy. That is what it is. But I do think I find it very hard to not see a degree of sexism in the way in which she has so completely fallen by the wayside by comparison to a peer like Giacometti.
Yeah, I certainly found when I was reading around Geometry of Fear from the contemporary sources, it's clear that she was considered really important at the time and a really pioneering artist. And now she's, compared to Giacometti, she's really barely known, which is such, because her work is so interesting and so evocative of that post-war moment of, like angst around the human figure and the human condition. And as you say, what it means to be a woman and those kind of redefinitions. Another thing I was wondering is whether you've identified any other women artists working with similar concerns in the Hanover programming. Because I was wondering, did Magda Cordell, I think, did Magda Cordell show there, or have I imagined that? Because she did
That's a question I've suddenly forgotten the answer to. She might have done one show. The Hanover had like a unusually high proportion of female artists being exhibited at the time, but Erica's tastes generally trended towards abstraction. A lot of the sculpture obviously is super figurative, but when it comes to everything else, she trended towards abstraction. So a lot of the female artists she's showing are people like Vieira da Silva, Anita De Caro. She was the first person to show Louise Nevelson. She's showing amazing female artists. There just aren't a ton more who I can say with like real confidence are fighting with the idea of what like a female depiction is. Eileen Agar, she showed a lot, but Eileen Agar, at the time she was showing her, I think she was the first person to show Agar post-war, but Agar's most kind of conflicted or interesting depictions of women really relate much more to the sort of work she's doing in the 1930s. From what I could find, and I will say I could find virtually no images of the work that the Hanover showed in the 1940s. I think most of it wasn't tackling those ideas, but I really like for one show I could not find a single image. I've got the list of all the titles. I can't find any of them. For the other show, I think I found two. So maybe there's something there. Agar certainly was thinking about ideas like that, but unfortunately, a lack of illustrated catalogs really
Yeah, so
stymies the ability to do visual analysis.
that's so interesting that you say she was really interested in abstract art, because I always think of her as more kind of like figurative based, just because she had, like Bacon, Freud in the early years, and then Paolozzi and Butler and these artists. And I've always kind of thought of her as more a kind of humanist.
She's doing a lot with abstraction. I think an interesting thing to think about when it comes to her is that actually Erica was she was a follower of a guru called Gurdjieff. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's very interested in Eastern philosophies, all of those, which was obviously very en vogue at the time. And a lot of the abstract artists that she was showing, but abstraction just in general, was very influenced by those kind of ideas and thought processes. And I think that is what feeds into it quite heavily. But no, when it comes to abstraction, actually, the Hanover was a gallery that showed a lot of it very early.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think if there are no more questions, give you one last minute if you want to pop any more questions in the chat, but I think we will draw to a close. So thank you so much, Cherith. That was really, really fascinating. Next week, we have Dr. Simon Pearce from Aberystwyth University talking about Alana Coleman, an Australian curator and gallerist who was really influential on the post-war London art scene in terms of supporting foreign artists coming to the city. And Coleman isn't in our exhibition because obviously she's not a refugee. So Simon's talk is going to really widen the lens on this whole phenomenon of art dealing and migration and the kind of internationalization of London in the post-war period, kind of slightly beyond the refugee angle. So do make sure you join us for that. Thank you for joining us this evening and have a lovely evening. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.